Let me ask you something. We're currently in the middle of the World Cup, aren't we? Last time, we talked about how the list of over 200 countries includes places like the Marshall Islands and the Cayman Islands, right? If we exclude those, you end up with maybe 100 to 150 countries that function like actual states, these more legitimate functioning nations. Out of those, if we narrow it down to the ones that have some real influence, including countries like Korea that are active players, the number comes down to 50 to 70 key nations. Now, when these countries interact through trade or politics, if we were to compare it to the World Cup or the Olympics, what's the biggest difference? It's that the referee is also playing in the game. To put it more academically, there are no real rules. Not only are there no rules, but there's also no impartial referee to enforce them either. But we assume there is one. Because without that assumption, the whole game falls apart. But those rules and referees, they're not what we imagine them to be. Of course, even in the World Cup or Olympics, FIFA and the IOC, they're not perfectly neutral either, at least not in an ideal sense. Still, they're objective enough that we mostly accept the results. But the global stage of economics and politics doesn't work that way. And it can't. That's our central theme for today. This should be obvious. But when I talk to people in Korea's intellectual circles, especially the so-called educated, there's a specific frustration I keep running into. They're missing the fundamental context of civilizational history. They uncritically adopt a moral lens of right and wrong. Of course, ethics play an important role in daily life, but they too casually apply that ethical framework to relations between states. And that just doesn't work. I get it. It's a natural instinct. We all tend to judge things in terms of right and wrong, but few realize that just one step outside that framework leads into the wild, beyond civilization. History shows us this, doesn't it? Has there ever been a time in history when a global geopolitical order was ever as rule-based as the World Cup or the Olympics? Did Korea and China ever end in a draw? Never, not even once. It's not even possible. But by assuming such a framework exists, people start applying moral judgments, and that's where irrational thinking begins. And that flawed logic leads to misguided behaviors because the whole pattern is broken from the start. So everything goes wrong. That's the idea I want you to take away today. Humans are strange creatures. When Keynes met Dexter White, he proposed the idea of something called Bancor. Keynes was a genius. If I had to name the two greatest minds that shaped humanity in the 20th century, not just brilliant, but profoundly influential, two people who reshaped our thought systems and institutions. If we're talking about giants who deeply intervened in the ideologies that govern our world, it would be Einstein and Keynes. That's not just my opinion, that's the consensus. So Keynes proposed the Bancor, an abstract form of gold, to build the post-war financial system. He argued, gold is limited by nature, so let's make an abstract version of it. Let's create a gold that exists only on the ledger. Let's call it Bancor. Of course, it was never going to be accepted. He was representing Britain, by then a fading power. People saw the global trade system, built on the gold standard and fixed exchange rates, as a self-evident order like Newtonian physics. The 19th century is often called the Golden Age, though clearly not for countries like Korea. Some sovereign states at the time, those that participated in the global system, believed that a shared set of rules existed. Believing such rules exist versus not believing in them makes a world of difference. Say you're an athlete preparing for 4 years to compete in the World Cup or the Olympics, and then you're told, actually, there are no rules. The game isn't even fair. Would you still put your heart into it? You'd practice with the assumption that the judgment, while imperfect, will at least aim for fairness. That's how they thought back then. But in the 19th century, Newtonian physics ruled until Einstein broke that paradigm. People believed the universe ran on absolute, self-evident truths, that it followed a rational, comprehensible order, and that we humans, based on that same logic, could also create a clearly defined, coherent order in our own societies. That was the spirit of the 19th century. And when applied to our topic, that spirit was embodied in the gold standard. But in the 1930s, the aftermath of World War I was poorly handled during the recovery process. And that mismanagement led to an economic crisis, one that might have passed as a mere recession. But with multiple factors compounding, it turned into a full-blown systemic failure. That was the Great Depression of 1929, and it lasted a full decade. In the US, unemployment typically hovered around 3%, but it soared close to 30%. And that's when people began questioning the self-evident order, especially in economics. They began to doubt whether such an order had ever really existed. And it was Keynes who articulated that doubt. He acknowledged the desire for fixed exchange rates, but designed a system that wouldn't be trapped by gold's limitations. That system was Bancor, an abstract political form of gold. Keynes was worried about the chronic trade surplus of the US. By 1945, the US was the only major economy left standing. It was assumed naturally that the US would maintain absolute dominance in trade. Well, Britain still held some semblance of stature, though its decline had already begun even before the war. Germany might have been a challenger, yet the bombings had left it in complete ruin, and Japan totally obliterated. So of course the US was running trade surpluses. Americans believed it, and so did the rest of the world. So Keynes worried that if a trade surplus country like the US kept building them up, it would lead to imbalances in global trade, just like during the interwar period in the 1930s. And once those imbalances grow, countries respond with protectionism. And protectionism, in turn, paves the way for dictators, nationalists, and populists to seize power. That, in Keynes's view, was how fascism and Nazism could rise again. So something had to restrain the surplus countries, and ideally that would be gold. Gold did this naturally. When gold piled up in surplus countries, its own dynamics would kick in. Trade-related prices would shift, and gold would flow to the deficit countries. Gold acted like an automatic stabilizer, a kind of autopilot. But now that gold was taken out of the equation, there was no more autopilot to regulate surplus nations. Instead, Keynes thought, if not gold, then shared rules acknowledged by all nations would be needed to keep surplus countries in check. Here's the thing about Keynes, right? His writing is incredibly nuanced and often hard to follow. As a writer myself, I pay attention to that. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of Keynes's writing because I've given up on his books midway more than once. It's really hard to get through his original texts. So I prefer to read the work of economists who've digested his ideas and rephrased them more clearly. They're just that complex and subtle. But if you distill his thinking, you'll see that Keynes wanted international order to resemble what I brought up earlier, something fair and objective, like the World Cup or the Olympics. But for that to work, you need referees, right? And referees need fair rules, so you need organizations like FIFA. That's why institutions like the IMF, WHO, WTO, and the International Court of Justice were created. So now you see where Keynes was coming from. He met with the US representative under orders to defend British imperial interests. But he was sharp enough to know the British Empire was already finished. So his concern became preventing the rise of American imperialism. But Americans had little appetite for imperialism, even without Keynes trying to stop it. That meant building a world order without empire. There weren't many ways to make that happen. But at least in finance, you're letting something natural like gold be the referee might offer some objectivity. Think about when you face a really tough decision. You could build a committee, appoint a representative, and give them discretionary power, but people don't really trust that. There's always conflict. No one likes handing over that much power to a single person. That's why we draw lots instead. Even if the allocation is wildly unfair, people end up accepting it because it wasn't anyone's personal decision. Same with gold. It isn't subject to anyone's will. But Keynes saw a fatal flaw in gold. It meant our economy would be constrained by nature itself. If the human economy is bound by the laws of nature, that's fine from the classical economics perspective. They believe the system will eventually balance itself. But Keynes didn't buy into that idea of the long run that classical economists rely on. He argued, we don't live in the long run, we live in the short run. That was Keynes's major contribution. He brought the short term into focus. Especially in financial crises, the short term is everything. We just saw the collapse of the FTX exchange. It's a huge event. And we still don't know how far the fallout will spread. If it were part of the legacy financial system, governments would have already stepped in. But from a classical economics lens, it'll sort itself out. Those who can't survive get wiped out, right? Eventually the system resets and starts anew. That's the thinking. But that assumes people can wait for the long run, can they? You might not care. After all, you're not holding Bitcoin. But if you are, you'd be thinking, you want me to just wait out the long run? Anyway, people might be willing to accept gold as an impartial judge. But Keynes didn't want to hand that role over to the US, so instead of letting the US be the referee, he proposed the Bancor system. And that's where both Keynes's brilliance and naivety come in. So what was his brilliance? Bancor eventually evolved into the SDR. His idea was rejected at the time by the US delegate Dexter White. But 20 years later, it came back as the IMF's special drawing rights, and it still exists today. That's his brilliance. And his naivety, let's go back to the question I asked earlier. How could global order ever work like the World Cup or the Olympics? Only angels could make that work. Literal angels. No international organization could pull it off. You'd need angels running the world. Then and only then could we have truly objective referees in world affairs. Because angels don't raise their own children here on earth. They're not players in the game. But here on earth, where everyone is a player, how can anyone still believe in fair play under so-called objective rules? I truly wonder what goes on in the minds of those who try to interpret geopolitics and economics through that moralistic lens. I just want to ask them, what planet are you from? I always ask, just give me one historical example. One moment in history when that actually worked. There's none. You don't even need to look. This is a deeply philosophical issue, international cooperation. And yeah, that includes Senegal, Uruguay, Korea, just like in the World Cup. Can these countries realistically come together and regulate the United States? We need the US. But the US is also the problem, you know? Because when it really matters, the US always breaks the rules. Because it plays both player and referee. So imagine Senegal, Uruguay, Korea, and others getting together and saying, let's regulate the US. Sometimes the US even plays along. Sure, go ahead. But when push comes to shove, nothing can restrain the US. After all, it's the US that carries the rules on its shoulders. Regardless of whether one supports or opposes the US, my words often come across as a challenge to their worldview, and that's a lonely position to be in. I just wish people would drop their biases and look at things at face value. I'm just telling it like it is. Telling the US, the one holding up the entire rules-based system, you must obey the rules. It's like your teenage son maxing out your credit card and shouting, "Don't interfere, I'm independent. You have no right to tell me what to do." That's how I think it sounds to the US. Pretty much the same as it sounds to you. If you have time, watch the movie John Wick. I've only seen the first one, but I heard there are 3 now. Even the first one was enough. It's more serious than you'd think. That Continental Hotel in the first movie is surprisingly deep in its theme. It's a place where killers like John Wick, whether they're bad or good, gather, all living outside the law. They operate by a shared code, and there's one rule that matters most. The hotel itself is like a giant crime syndicate, portrayed as a terrifying power. They don't take sides. They're the referees. Break one of their rules, and they will destroy you. No exceptions. Like no killing on hotel grounds. Simple but strict. This kind of institution, like the Continental, is rooted in European civilization. Sure, there are equivalents in Asia, probably in China too, I just haven't studied them. But it's in the post-Socratic Western intellectual tradition that this idea was deeply explored. Socrates and his dialogues with students often revolve around these ideas. The concept of fair rules is central in Western philosophy, especially the kind that's neutral. To Westerners, the Continental isn't just fiction. It hits something deep in how they think, rules that are unbiased. If you want to know what neutral rules really mean, watch that movie. The Continental. It doesn't make moral judgments, it simply enforces the rules. But if everything stayed that clean, it wouldn't make for much of a movie, right? I didn't watch the 3rd movie, but apparently Keanu Reeves messes things up. He gets tricked or pushed into doing something he's not supposed to do inside the hotel. Probably killed someone. And then the hotel goes after him. But lets him off the hook. I knew it the moment I saw the first movie. That whole hotel system, it's a metaphor. I knew it'd end up breaking its own rules. Same with the post-1945 world order. The US wrote the rules and acted as the referee, but it's broken them many times. Sometimes openly, sometimes in secret, but repeatedly. But what else could anyone do? Ask the US to submit to a system it enforces with aircraft carriers. Does that even make sense? Then what you're really saying is this. If the US breaks the rules, should its own aircraft carriers turn around and attack itself? That's nonsense. Total absurdity. Have you seen Star Wars? That movie deals with the exact same Western philosophical dilemma. The Jedi, they protect the Empire. It used to be a republic, then it became an empire. One of the republic's supposed guardians on some planet was secretly plotting to become emperor. So really, the Star Wars saga is the story of Skywalker, caught in all of this. The story then continues with the son. It explores how Skywalker ended up turning to the dark side. He was one of the most promising Jedi. He was considered a chosen one, destined by prophecy. So despite his low rank, he became a member of the Jedi Council. The council members are like samurai, representatives of different species and planets. And their inspiration? They were modeled after the Knights Templar, who protected Jerusalem during the Crusades for about a century. They were warriors said to be worth 100 men. That's why they were called the Knights Templar, or the Holy Knights. So the Jedi were partly inspired by them. But here's the key point. The Jedi aren't an official government institution. Yet whenever the Republic is in danger, they take it upon themselves to punish threats to the system. And it's the Jedi who decide who the threat is. Sometimes they judge wisely, sometimes not. The important thing is, Skywalker, who later becomes Darth Vader, joins them, then uses their power to betray the Republic. So the very elite force designed to protect the Republic ends up being the one that destroys it. Isn't that a catastrophic design flaw? We build a system, then embed something inside it to defend the system itself. And we grant that part immense power and give it to the most capable. But what if they turn against the very system? Then it all collapses. What alternative is there? Western philosophy, beginning with Socrates, has long wrestled with this very question. That's why symbols matter. Symbols are necessary. Symbols. These 2 books are totally unrelated. One is Changing Fortunes. The other is 1587, A Year of No Significance. The books have nothing in common, and they're about completely different eras. One is about the Ming Dynasty, the other about the dollar system from the 1950s to the 1990s. One focuses on financial systems and the rise of the dollar, while the other is about imperial bureaucracy in Ming China. But to me, they feel strikingly similar. Because at their core, both are meditations on the nature of order. They explore what makes order possible, and they arrive at similar insights. Paul Volcker, the man who revived the dollar, is considered a role model for today's Fed chair, Jerome Powell. He was over 2 meters tall. Why he didn't become a basketball player and instead became Fed chair, I don't know. But today he's widely recognized as the man who saved the dollar. In one of his books, he writes something interesting. Defending the dollar against gold wasn't a burden, it was a badge of honor. He said this during his time at the US Treasury in the 60s and 70s. It was a privilege, a point of national pride and a responsibility to the world. That was Volcker's reflection on the 1960s. What does this mean? The post-1945 system didn't completely abandon gold. The dollar was fixed to gold, $35 per ounce. And at that time, a significant portion of the world's gold, some sources say 60%, others say 80%. It depends on how you count it. Whatever the number, the bulk of it was held by the US. So if anyone brought $35, the US could and did exchange it for an ounce of gold. But what kind of world was that really? Outside the US, getting dollars was incredibly difficult. Ironically, gold was easier to come by than dollars. Because to get dollars into circulation, the US would have to run trade deficits. But back then, it was running surpluses. The US was earning dollars, not distributing them. So if you wanted dollars, you had to borrow them from the US. Borrowing dollars from the US, then using those same dollars to demand gold from the US. No one would do that. That's why the system worked for a while. But in the 1960s, things began to shift. Germany had recovered and Japan was rising. These countries began running massive trade surpluses with the US. So defending the dollar became a problem one day, out of nowhere. On the unofficial markets, not official gold exchanges, gold was trading at $40 an ounce. The official rate was still $35. The financial system was breaking down. Why was it exactly $35? Why not 36 or 34 or 37? It was just $35. It was symbolic, a symbol. And symbols matter. The emperor's ceremonial plowing wasn't devoid of symbolism. It wasn't just empty ritual. 3 times a month, the emperor and his ministers met with firm resolve to seek and apply the wisest policies found in the classics and historical texts. In order to reach the state of great harmony, you might think being emperor of the Ming dynasty would be bliss. But if you read 1587, A Year of No Significance, you'll see otherwise. Most of the Ming emperors were in fact deeply unhappy. Not because of family drama, but because their lives were exhausting. They had to hold these philosophical sessions with their ministers 3 times a month. These sessions involved studying and debating Confucian teachings. In Korean dramas, the king often teaches his officials. Maybe that worked in Joseon, but in China, not a chance. What chance does a royal have against ministers who've spent their lives obsessed with Confucius? These ministers were basically Confucian nerds, test-taking geniuses. The emperor inherited his position, but the people beside him earned theirs through brutal exams. In China, no less. Can you imagine the competition? And the emperor had to sit there and listen to lectures on what Confucius said. 3 times a month, the emperor had to sit through moral scolding from his ministers. Why? Because you may be emperor, but you've been entrusted by heaven to govern us. And heaven's will has been revealed through Confucius. So you may be emperor, but you are still a student under Confucius. That performance played out 3 times a month, and the emperor couldn't even doze off. He'd get scolded if he did. It was the one time ministers could openly rebuke the emperor. It was symbolic, but it might not have been just symbolic. So what kind of symbol are we talking about? Something like the great harmony. In other words, the emperor isn't ruling us by fiat, but rather we all stand together under the teachings of Confucius. Now here's where the real dilemma comes in. Isn't this the same dilemma I posed at the beginning? If the emperor makes the rules, how do you protect the rules from the emperor himself? The Jedi are the guardians of the Republic, you know. So how do you protect the Republic from the Jedi? The US maintains the global order. But who protects that order from the US itself? How do you protect the rules from the emperor? With this kind of symbol, like saying, even the emperor must learn. Gold wasn't actually in everyday use anymore. Still, the world needed the symbolic reassurance that the US remained bound to the gold standard. It's what kept the World Cup and Olympics running, at least in spirit. By 1964, foreign public institutions held more dollars than the US had in gold reserves. Just look at that. If they all demanded gold from the US at once, the amount of dollars in circulation now exceeded America's gold reserves. So what if France, Germany, the UK, and Japan teamed up and said, cool, well, hey, give us back our gold, you can keep your paper dollars. What happens then? The US would have to default, officially refuse to redeem gold, but that didn't happen. Would they really all come at once? No massive gold run ever materialized. There was no immediate crisis. Each country claimed gold at different times, driven by its own needs. But the symbolic trust in gold was already gone by 1964. France was the first to get angry. Wait a minute, so you're giving us ink-printed paper while you keep all the gold for yourself? That's outrageous. So why do symbols matter? There are many reasons, but here's one. Humans behave in groups. We're herd animals. And in any herd, some kind of order is absolutely essential. Strip order down to its core and its hierarchy. In an all-boys middle school, when the school year changes, there's usually a quick reordering. Nowadays, we have anti-bullying policies, but back in my day, why did that happen? Because these chimpanzees didn't yet know who ranked where. So they had to establish the order, confirm the hierarchy. If everyone fights everyone else, you get a number of fights equal to n choose 2. Would you really see 60 choose 2 fights in a 60-person class? Of course not. Humans aren't that dumb. A few key fights are enough. Once a few establish dominance, the rest fall into place. Some don't even participate. They opt out entirely. But here's the key. This is where the dilemma of collective behavior starts. In formal terms, we call it the prisoner's dilemma. It's a dilemma that shows up among all herd-forming animals, including us. The best case scenario, I become the top dog. The worst case, there's no hierarchy at all. Sure, being number one is great, but the absolute worst is if the whole community falls apart. Take bees, for example. Worker bees are female, but they don't reproduce. Only the queen does. Technically, workers can reproduce too. So when a worker bee lays eggs, other workers kill the offspring. The best outcome is to be the one who gets to reproduce. But the worst outcome is if everyone tries to reproduce and the entire hive collapses. So they strike a delicate balance. Sure, it'd be great if our country got to rule the world. But we all know that's not going to happen. The worst would be if the world turns into a jungle with no rules at all. So if you want to find balance between those two extremes without leaning on symbols, you'd have to fight it out every year, constant battles year after year. In other words, take away the symbols and it all turns into a brawl. That's why symbols matter. They're not just decorative. Symbols are substance. Yuval Harari makes this point persuasively in his book Sapiens. Let's say one country gets flagged. Markets are beginning to suspect the country might not be able to convert its currency into dollars. These days, it's not about gold, it's all about dollars. There's a growing suspicion they won't hand over the dollars. If you ask, that's when the market attacks. The pressure starts building in that direction. On paper, it's give yen, get dollars, but their reserves are practically out of dollars. So the yen comes under massive selling pressure. Then the Bank of Japan has to scramble to buy up yen, burning through what little dollar reserves it has, and those precious dollars gone even faster. Without symbols, you'd have to fight this kind of war constantly. That's why symbolic trust is so crucial. Both of these books at their core are about symbols. Let's look at a case. In 1967, the British pound collapsed under pressure. In 1964, the Labour government, with strong socialist leanings, took power. Markets got nervous. Investors feared this government might impose capital controls and curb market freedoms. So the Prime Minister tried to reassure them, we won't impose capital controls, we won't devalue the pound. Britain has always been a country obsessed with style over substance. We saw this last time. After World War I, they returned to the gold standard, even without the strength to back it. Yet no devaluation followed. They're the only country that can hold over-the-top royal weddings. Lavish to the extreme. And instead of being criticized, they're praised. That's the power of British pageantry. It's all about pomp. They promised not to devalue the pound, but in the end, they backed down. And a few years later, they formally asked the IMF for a devaluation. They tried everything. The British government insisted, we'll do anything except devalue the pound. And they really meant it. But once the market lost faith in the pound, the attacks began. That's why gangsters put such a premium on keeping face. Even if they lose everything, they have to hold on to their pride. Because once they lose face, their own guys might turn on them. You never know who'll challenge your authority next. Someone could stab you in the back. That's why maintaining pride is key to survival. To stop the panic from spreading, US President Lyndon Johnson pledged to maintain the dollar's peg to gold, but the market didn't believe him. Then came a geopolitical challenge from France. President de Gaulle of France was skeptical of the US. He was an anti-American nationalist. He openly criticized its privileged position. On top of that, he was sharp. Brilliant, really. That's why he could frame the issue so cleverly. At the time, many European companies were being taken over by US firms. So de Gaulle laid out a theory, flawed but persuasive on the surface. He said the US is printing money and channeling it to its corporations. And they're using that printed money to swallow up Europe's industries. Even if you say, come on, that can't be true, it still sounds weirdly convincing, right? Plenty of people in our country believe that too. Even one of my own students posted that nonsense on Facebook. I said, did you even study? What were you doing in class? Anyway, de Gaulle stirred the pot with statements like this. Those dollars, they just keep the printing presses rolling and gobble up Europe with paper that's practically worthless. Germany's central bank pledged not to demand gold for its dollar reserves. But as the Vietnam War dragged on, trust in the US and in the dollar started to unravel. That was it. This was the trigger. Why did these challenges suddenly emerge in the 60s? What made the US lose its authority, its aura? Vietnam, the pride of the US, its symbolic dominance, was shattered. When it enters a war, it's expected to win, but Vietnam broke that rule. And when that happens, the whole image crumbles. Once the symbolic structure propping up the global order collapses. What follows is chaos and defiance. So finally, in 1967, the US responded. At the IMF's annual meeting, held in Brazil, they said, if we call it Bancor, it just screams Keynes. Let's call it SDR, special drawing rights. But let's be real, it was basically Keynes's Bancor. They couldn't just say, no more gold. Rather, they said something like, you wouldn't have liked suggesting dollars as reserve assets instead of gold. No one trusted the dollar back then. So how about this? We create a joint ledger system, a virtual currency. We'll call it special drawing rights. Cool. Everyone agreed, except France, because the US was acting as the referee in this World Cup and Olympics of global finance. And remember what we asked earlier? If the US is playing the game, who referees then? Turns out it was also refereeing the game itself. That's why France pushed back. As France put it, the Americans are playing the game and refereeing it too. The US responded, all right then, we won't be the referee anymore. If we're not the referee, let's build something new. What do you think of this thing called SDR? France was like, hey, it smells fishy, but the rest of the package, well, at least it had symbolic value. Better than relying on the dollar anyway, they figured. Here's a funny story about Japan's Ministry of Finance officials. These are the creme de la creme, graduates of Tokyo University who passed the nation's most elite civil service exam. And among those, only the absolute top were selected to work at the Ministry of Finance. If test scores defined intelligence, these people were in a league of their own. Think of them as the kind of ministers who could lecture a Ming emperor on Confucius. These elite officials figured, hey, SDR sounds like a great idea. And off they went to the US. They dropped by the IMF headquarters in Washington and asked the managing director, could you show us the vault where the SDR is stored? It was hilarious, honestly. But the real comedy, no one laughed. That's how serious it was. Why? Because SDR is just a ledger entry. You'd expect an actual ledger or even a vault. But it's all just numbers on a screen. Where would you store that? It's like Bitcoin. It's like asking, where is Bitcoin stored? Bancor originally was meant to be an abstract version of gold. Paper gold in name, but neither paper nor gold in reality. It's a system, a form of order, a system meant to restrain the US. The dollar couldn't serve that function. So they introduced SDR as a buffer, a mediating layer in the global accounts. It helps smooth out imbalances between surplus and deficit countries. Gold was great, but as I said earlier, it lacks flexibility. And at this point, it wasn't just about economic rigidity there. The US simply didn't have the gold to back it up anymore. France and others had slowly drained it away. So the US now had to suspend gold convertibility, which was realistic, but if they did it, what would collapse? If they said, you can no longer exchange dollars for gold, no. Sure, it would be practical, but what symbol would that destroy? What's today's lecture about? It's the collapse of symbols. The whole thing falls apart. It would destroy the idea that even the US is bound by a higher order, like Confucian ideals. Remember the Ming Dynasty analogy? Even the emperor had to attend Confucian lectures from his ministers 3 times a month. So SDR was welcomed because of what it symbolized. It exists as a symbolic institution. And it still carries symbolic weight today. But then some foolish people, armed with half-baked ideas, they go around saying it's SDR, not Bitcoin, that will replace the dollar. Just fools, foolish without end. So where did they go wrong, tell me? Where exactly? Remember I said Keynes was both a genius and a bit naive? Well, the whole SDR idea is this. It assumes that if we create a FIFA-like organization, it will fairly govern the world, pure idealism. But that kind of thinking is just not possible. Come on, there's not a single real-world example. That's like saying the US can keep itself in check with its own aircraft carriers. But SDR, it's symbolic, like a Ming emperor who never sat for an exam, but still listens to Confucian lectures like a student. No one would dare make the emperor actually take the test unless they had a death wish. Torn apart, literally quartered alive. Your Majesty, pop quiz today. Yeah, that's not happening. Still, the emperor remains bound by the system. And that gives us humans a bit of comfort. At least we're not being ruled by a total madman, right? We can believe the one ruling us abides by Confucian truth, upholds fair rules, and strives for virtue. So maybe being ruled isn't so unbearable after all. Keynes wrote, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It's an important book. I've read it myself. But I couldn't make sense of it. The writing is so convoluted. Turns out I'm not the only one. Everyone who read it at the time agreed. It's a mess to read, but undeniably a genius's work. Later, Keynesian economists organized and refined the ideas because they were constantly debating with classical economists. So today I'll give you the essence, nice and clear. You'll walk away with the core of macroeconomics. This book essentially created the field of macroeconomics. Before that, macroeconomics didn't really exist. Then came concepts like total output and aggregate demand. With these aggregate concepts, he reshaped how we talk about economies. But economists like Mises and Hayek, they strongly opposed reducing the economy to totals and aggregates. Now here's the key chart. This axis here is total national output. Let's call it GDP. And this axis is price level. As prices fall, national income, measured through aggregate demand, is expected to increase. That's why the lower the price, the higher the demand, hence the aggregate demand curve. Not demand for one product, but for the total demand for all goods and services in the economy. That part's fairly intuitive, right? You can derive this from wages or labor costs, but that's not crucial for now. Just understand this part. When prices drop, demand increases because things are cheaper. When prices rise, demand shrinks. So the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Just know, the economy operates along these points. Even here, Keynesians and classicists differ a bit, but not enough to fight over. The real debate, whether an aggregate supply curve even exists, and if it does, what slope does it have? This is the aggregate supply curve. Before Keynes, this kind of thinking simply didn't exist. If they had to draw something, the classical economists viewed the aggregate supply curve as fixed and vertical. Just because prices rise, why would production increase? And if prices fall, why would production drop? Exactly. Because producers make decisions with full awareness of price levels. If you run a restaurant, you have to pay wages and buy green onions, cabbage, and rice. Costs are everywhere. Let's say prices rise and your food prices go up too. Do you produce more just because you can charge more? No, you go broke. It's not just the food price that's going up, and your labor costs go up, green onion prices go up, and so does the cost of rice. You see the point? That's why the classical model uses a vertical supply curve. Output is unaffected by prices. But here's where Keynes makes an important leap. I read his book in my 20s. It was tough going. Keynes absolutely shredded the classical model. The whole book is an attack on that logic. He said it only works in theory, in a perfect world. In most cases, the aggregate supply curve has a slope. It's not vertical. Because wages are sticky, they don't adjust easily. Say you're running a restaurant, you can raise your menu prices, but you don't have to raise your employees' wages, at least not until next year. If that's the case, then when prices rise, you gain. Let's assume no other costs exist. Just imagine, you're only paying wages to make food. Then if prices go up, you'd be more willing to produce. That's what Keynes argued. So if prices rise, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward instead of standing vertically. Why does this matter? This is the classical supply curve, and the sloped one, that's Keynes's aggregate supply curve. In economics, we call them curves, even when they're drawn as straight lines. But here's the important part. All you need to know is Keynes advocated fiscal policy, specifically deficit spending. Spend more than you collect in taxes. Why? Because when the government spends more, the economy gets stimulated. What does that mean? It means that when the government increases spending while prices remain stable, by building roads and other infrastructure, it creates demand for cement, labor, and other materials, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. When the demand curve moves, the equilibrium point, X, shifts to the right, and total output increases. National income increases, and prices probably rise too. Yes, prices go up, but in some situations, like during the Great Depression, the demand curve flattens out like this. It just lies there, sluggish and limp. In that case, if the government increases spending, you boost national income with barely any inflation. Anyway, that's what Keynes was saying. Because wages and other factors are rigid. Production isn't completely independent of prices, as classical economists claim. That's why the supply curve has a slope. Therefore, if the government spends more, it can revive a sluggish, near-dead economy. That part's not the most important. This is what really matters. This whole logic serves as the foundation for justifying the U.S. New Deal policy after the Great Depression. Here's the real theme of today, the activism of macroeconomic policy. It means government bureaucrats should take an active role in the economy. If bureaucrats step in and act proactively, whether they spend on defense, build schools, or expand welfare, just doing something, because the supply curve is flat in the short run, they can boost output without triggering inflation. Here's the key point, whether Keynes intended it or not. Why has Keynesianism dominated since 1945? Even I, before diving into geopolitics through Bitcoin. I thought the Keynes versus classical debate was just about wage flexibility. That's naive, it's not just that. Keynes is basically the Confucius of the 20th century. His general theory of employment, interest, and money, it gave the bureaucratic elite of the nation-state legitimacy a sense of mission and pride. Put simply, it was perfect as a ruling ideology. Now let's talk briefly about democracy and liberalism. Philosophically, liberalism and democracy are not the same. Scholars say pre-World War II, classical liberalism shifted into what's called embedded capitalism afterward. I don't love that translation of embedded, but there's no better option. Embedded liberalism means the economy is tightly interwoven with broader social issues. So just hear it once and let it go, it's fine, like a trivia term. It's mostly academic posturing, honestly not very useful. What really matters is the underlying idea. Actually, even that's not super important. In the classical liberal era, people valued global free markets over welfare-focused nation-state systems. In that era of classical liberalism, before Keynes, there was no such role as economic bureaucrat. There was no reason for it to exist. The modern nation-state, whether communist or democratic, arose with the political power of the working class. With massive industrial infrastructure, auto and steel factories emerged in the early 20th century. And people started asking, are humans truly individuals? Rational actors, as classical economics claims? Because clearly we act collectively. Steel workers, auto workers, they're collectives, right? Yes, they're groups. On a conveyor belt trying to measure each individual's output, that's a joke. It doesn't even make sense. Sometimes the group performs well, sometimes it doesn't. That's why under communism and beyond, the so-called working class began to gain immense political power. Communism outright declared them the rulers of society. And even in places like the US, they started having major influence in politics. Just as Keynes predicted, wages don't adjust flexibly to the market. They rise quickly, but hardly ever go down. And because wages don't fall, we don't know if inflation raises output. But when prices fall, entrepreneurs can't make a profit. So they shut down production, just like that. In classical economics, here's how unemployment disappears. When the economy is bad, employers cut wages. That helps them adapt to the market. No need for mass layoffs. But if you can't cut wages, you just shut things down. That's why factories vanish. So the world you're witnessing, is it a world where companies disappear or where they cut wages? Do your companies cut wages? Probably not. They'd rather stop hiring than lower pay, right? That's why modern business leaders actually prefer inflation. Since they can't cut wages, they rely on rising prices instead. So unlike what the classical economists think, wages aren't flexible, which is why Keynes drew a sloped supply curve. That said, today's industrial structure is different once again. Now comes the key idea, the new left. When talking about the 20th century new left, you can't leave out Karl Polanyi. Polanyi wasn't like traditional leftists. The left usually doesn't believe in market efficiency, but Polanyi actually acknowledged market efficiency. Sure, markets allocate resources efficiently, but markets must be embedded within democratic rules. There are values more important than the market. Politics, religion, they operate on a different value system. Yeah, you can't leave everything to the market. Humans aren't commodities. That's his logic, and it's quite compelling. Karl Polanyi, public authority should lie with the nation state, not the market. He differs from the old left in that he acknowledges the value of markets, but believes markets should be bound within democratic systems. And that sets him apart from classical liberals too. That's the new left, Karl Polanyi. In short, Keynesians and those who follow Polanyi are pretty similar. The nation state governs the market. Even China has the Analects and the Tao Te Ching. Why can't the Tao Te Ching become a ruling ideology, even if it works for the elite? Because it tells you to do nothing. But the Analects of Confucius, it tells you to act. That's why Confucianism could serve as a ruling ideology. Keynes believed that increasing the money supply lowers interest rates. Print money and interest rates drop. That's how the LM curve is drawn in macroeconomics. It's called the liquidity effect. Whether or not you fully get this, I'll explain it anyway. Keynes assumed that people hold assets, money or bonds, or even stocks. That counts too, let's just say assets or cash. A drop in interest rates goes together with higher bond prices. That's when people start pulling their money out to consume or invest because they think bond prices will soon drop. So when rates are low, demand for money rises. That's the liquidity effect. But when Keynesians went ahead and expanded the money supply, rates ended up rising instead. Because pumping money leads to inflation, the price effect kicks in. Such effects shift the whole dynamic. As people spend and invest more, interest rates go up. So the issue is one of timing, velocity. The first graph represents the Keynesian view. Flooding the economy with money during a downturn causes rates to plunge at first. They may rebound but never quite return to where they were. In this case, rates rise even higher. But Keynesians argue it's just a matter of velocity. They say the liquidity effect comes first. But mainstream economists critical of Keynes would argue there's no liquidity effect. Printing money only pushes interest rates higher. But here's the important part. Listen carefully to what I'm saying here. Keynes's theory, from a purely economic perspective, lacks consistency and clarity. So I used to dismiss Keynes a bit. But after studying geopolitics, I changed my mind. A lot of Keynes's assumptions simply haven't held up over time. Classical economics is logically much more robust. But the problem is, the world isn't just economics. This model is called the ISLM curve. It's a standard part of any macroeconomics course. IS stands for investment and saving, real economy stuff. It's the investment savings curve. The vertical axis here is interest rates, and the horizontal axis is national income. So the curve slopes depending on the interest rate. Now the issue is with the LM curve, which represents equilibrium in the money market. Due to liquidity effects and similar factors, Keynes assumed the LM curve is flat. In short, a flat LM curve. Classical economists, on the other hand, see it as upright. You don't need to understand why for now. If it's steep, the outcome changes, just like we saw earlier. Say the government prints money or uses fiscal policy to stimulate demand. Then, if the LM curve is flat, income rises without affecting interest rates. But if the curve is vertical, government spending ends up raising only interest rates. That's called the crowding out effect. So today I've been laying out Keynes's theory through these diagrams. Yeah, you might be wondering, wait, is this a macroeconomics lecture? Yes, I'm aware this is a class on geopolitics. But this part, you really need to understand. Most people trained in economics today are Keynesians. Only 90% of mainstream economists follow Keynesian thinking. Because Keynesianism became the dominant ideology in the age of nation states. Not because it's always correct, but because it's necessary. Keynesians emphasize the multiplier effect. So what is this multiplier effect? Let's say the government spends 1 million won. That becomes someone else's income. 1 million in earnings. Then they save 200,000 won and spend 800,000 won. At this point, that 800,000 becomes someone else's income, right? They save 20% again, so that's 160,000 won, and spend the remaining 640,000. So the government only spent 1 million won initially, but it keeps cascading through the economy. That's what we call the multiplier effect multiplier. Now, if we map this out on a graph, whether from an aggregate demand curve or the ISLM model, when the curve is sloped like this, the government shifts it through fiscal policy. The increase in output, that's what we call the multiplier. But if the government increases spending by this amount, why doesn't output rise proportionally? Well, it just doesn't, because of friction in the system, similar to what we see in physics. That friction can cause prices or interest rates to rise instead. That's the crowding out effect. Government spending does increase income, but the more the government spends, talents that should have gone to more productive sectors end up in government positions. Cement that should have gone to better use is poured into wasteful infrastructure projects. So the effect starts to fade, like trying to start an old tractor. You pull the cord once hard. That initial burst is called priming the pump. That's an example of the multiplier in action. Keynesians believe priming the pump effectively stimulates the economy. But classical economists reject the idea. They say there's no priming effect. It just overheats the engine. You just make noise and heat, no real movement. All you're doing is making things worse. That's their argument. That's why these two sides are always fighting. There are mountains of papers supporting both sides. So which side is right? Well, this isn't physics. It's part of the humanities. After all my studying, I've realized it's not as important as people think. It changes with the times. It follows trends. So Keynesianism doesn't dominate because it's correct. It dominates when the times demand Keynesian logic. What I mean is, when governments need to print money or run deficits, then Keynesians gain influence in academia and politics. But that same logic can eventually bring about economic trouble. When bureaucrats dominate too much, resources are misallocated. It's common sense. Resource allocation ends up relying on discretionary decisions by bureaucrats. Society falls into a kind of collective depression. And when the system collapses, classical liberalism resurfaces. What I'm saying might sound shocking to you. You won't hear this in most academic settings. We claim to be searching for truth, right? But if you think about what I just said, it's actually a deeply agnostic statement about truth itself. I'm saying that there's no such thing as truth. People just order whatever version suits their needs at the moment, right? That's a dangerous thought. But in my experience, it holds true. So here's the real takeaway today. This is what matters. Keynes, in truth, wasn't just doing economics, whether he realized it or not. He was a geopolitical thinker in economist clothing. He didn't write a book on economics. He wrote political theory. That's how I see it. Keynes's framework for interest rates and money demand, it's been torn apart by economists over and over. It's a total mess now. And yet, Keynes still mattered. He grasped the deeper meaning of the centralized nation state in shaping both economies and ecosystems. That the state must play a role, not for better or worse. Even his critics, when they step outside the neat mathematical world of neoclassical economics, that other crowd, they're obsessed with math. These people are mathematically brilliant, but even they can't help but wrestle with government behavior and ultimately human nature. Keynesian economists, on the other hand, don't lean heavily on numbers. Bitcoiners are challenging the entire intellectual foundation Keynes laid down. That's the real crux of the matter. Bitcoiners are re-examining the intellectual roots laid by Keynes. And the issue isn't economics, it's about worldview. Bitcoiners are reflecting deeply on Keynes's assumptions and launching a philosophical counterattack. And they are revisiting the true debate between mainstream economics and Keynesianism and reviving it in today's world, even through events like the FTX collapse. And here's the question. Can nation-state governments truly create a stable, sustainable, and prosperous order? Can a group of nation-states come together, like an Olympic-style collective, training up world-class athletes for a common cause? And can they do that without a global system guiding them? That's the core question. Keynes's Bancor wasn't a geopolitical move. It was a philosophical blueprint tailored for the global elite. It was a way to shield Britain from America's aggressive monetary and trade dominance. Each nation needs the ability to control capital outflows, like gold, just to maintain low interest rates. What Keynes envisioned was, in its own way, quite idealistic. If a country falls into recession, it needs to lower its own interest rates. But if they do that, does capital flow in or out? Now that the US is raising rates, is capital flowing in or out? Remember, capital flows to where interest rates are higher. So where does capital go? It goes to where rates are higher. If the US raises rates and we don't, what happens to us? Capital flows out and our currency gets crushed. Our exchange rate tanks. To stop that, what do? We raise rates too. So we build a national firewall, just like Keynes imagined. Then nation states regain discretionary power. The US may raise rates, but we're in a recession. So like Japan, we'll just keep our rates low. That's the approach. But Keynes's vision had a built-in contradiction. He imagined a world where nation states could act independently while the global system still held together. The very fact that peace is maintained, that's what we call the global system. And yet each nation gets to act on its own while peace still holds. It doesn't work. It's impossible. It's just an ideology. That's all it is. That's why Bancor, when you look closely, is kind of absurd. It was designed to constrain the US. So Bancor was a ledger, a fictional one at that. It wasn't like Bitcoin where decentralized nodes prevent arbitrary inflation or deflation. They just sit around a table and decide what numbers to put in that ledger. Because Keynes didn't know about decentralized ledgers, he assumed decisions could just be made by committee. He imagined global elites sitting down to rein in the US and creating a banking system within a US-led order to hold the US in check. Pure fantasy. That's nuts, isn't it? Anyone hearing this should realize it's nonsense. But on the surface, it sounds convincing. People with zero understanding of global systems love to compare them to the Olympics or the World Cup. That's how you were raised too. But events like the Olympics require a committed host willing to shoulder enormous effort. Someone who doesn't compete in the game. So in geopolitics, who pays to maintain the system without playing in it? Do you see anyone stepping up? Can you build that? You want something more flexible than gold, but without relying on the US dollar, you're basically asking for a contradiction. It must be more flexible than gold. But who defines flexible? The US, of course. That's why it can't work. But then they say we shouldn't rely on the dollar. Now imagine the Olympics did have rules, and those rules were completely arbitrary, left to someone's discretion. They could swing either way, depending on who's in charge. You can dress it up in nice language, like, we'll judge fairly by conscience. But then you have to ask, what is fair exactly? Ask who? Ask the track committee, FIFA, the IOC. In the end, the IOC is just a bunch of people in a room. Keynes believed that with a bank for international settlements, capital could be better regulated. Today, that vision could take shape in the form of CBDCs. Here's what he believed. If Britain and the US created the system together and others agreed to the terms, then the rest of the world would naturally join as members. No need for endless negotiations. If the US and UK led by example and established a system, others would eventually join. There's a line like this in the Analects of Confucius. To govern with virtue is like the North Star. It stays in its place and the other stars revolve around it. Confucius said this. To rule by virtue is to be like the North Star. All the stars revolve around it. That's the core teaching of the Analects. How is this any different? It's not. If the US and UK take the lead, others will naturally join. At least that's the naive belief. It's not completely absurd. It came out of a very deep geopolitical dilemma. Trying to avoid two evils led to this compromise. But Keynes's idea ignores geopolitics from the start. It ignores the logic of power. Imagine going to the world-dominating US and saying, hey, you need to submit to Bangkok rules now. The idea itself was completely absurd. Peter Zeihan mocked the idea like this. Keynes tried to defend the British pound by relying entirely on America's good faith. That's what he said. Hey, you need to protect our pound. He couldn't say pound, so he used Bangkok instead. Keynes wanted to create a supranational currency to dethrone both gold and the dollar. In the post-war world, Keynes hoped the US would become a symbolic monarch. In the post-war world, Keynes hoped the US would become a symbolic monarch. And here's where symbolism really matters. What is a symbolic monarch? It's the ideal emperor dreamt of in ancient China. A symbolic monarch exists but does not rule. The US should uphold the world but not interfere. It may protect the world but must not control it. We humans live in groups. We create abstract systems. And we always want symbolic excuses to believe in. That's idealism. But we need to wake up. These things don't actually exist. The only reality we're left with is people assuming it exists. People believe it exists. That itself is reality. The fact that people assume it's real, for observers like us, that assumption is reality. So if you treat that assumption as real, it may be fiction, but people believe in it. That's why middle schoolers don't brawl every time classes are reshuffled. Because symbols do exist in our minds. But the US can't just be a symbolic monarch. The dollar was already emerging as the global currency. So why would the US hand over that monetary power to an international body? The rise of the dollar came from geopolitical involvement and real sacrifice. How much blood did the US spill? Who's going to bleed geopolitically for Bangkok? No one has ever shed blood for it. It wasn't exactly for the dollar, but they bled for what the dollar represents, America's glory. And even now, many are still willing to bleed for it. But who would sacrifice for the glory of the UN? Would you? If you were drafted under the UN flag to go fight in Ukraine, would you go? Of course not. But people are fighting for Ukraine's own glory right now. You see the difference? FIFA and the IOC don't actually exist. What exists is imperial power. So what did Keynes miss? The Keynes versus White debate was really about this. Should the US actively protect the global order, or should it become a symbolic force beyond it? It was a philosophical question of statehood. Back then, idealism worked because the US was the only one left standing. But from Dexter White's point of view, all those so-called fair rules pushed by Keynes and the other losers were just sour grapes because the US was number one. If the pound had still been dominant, even Britain wouldn't have listened to Keynes. If Keynes had emerged in the late 1800s, when the pound still ruled, and had said, we need to restrain the pound and design a new system. Let's create an abstract currency like Bangkok and bind the pound to it. Would Britain have listened? When Britain pushed this idea, their first hope, of course, was for the pound to stay on top. But if that was off the table, having some kind of alternative seemed better than nothing. They didn't like the dollar, so Bangkok became their fallback. Every country does this. In the end, any country bashing the dollar just wants its own currency to take the throne. But will other countries buy into it? Sure, the dollar's flawed. So what, the yen, the yuan, seriously? The pound, that pompous old relic? So when we start talking about replacing the dollar today, we try to invent something abstract. But in the end, we're left with the euro, the yuan, or the yen. And the moment we compare them one-to-one with the dollar, the illusion shatters. Can we trust the euro when it takes n choose 2 to make every single decision? You'll never get anywhere. Don't forget, Greece is in that mix. Do you really want a global monetary system built on the standards of those countries? Of course not. With the yuan, you can't even trust the statistics. Do you want a currency to lead the world when we don't even know when its central bank meets? If anything, the yen is most similar to Bitcoin, right? Long-term stagnation, deflation, yet the yen holds its value. But geopolitically, we'd never accept that. So it all loops back to the dollar. No matter how much we think about it, it's hard to go beyond Keynes. That's the core message of this lecture. People say they want democracy, but what they're really after is bureaucracy and rule by elites. So those who are politically inclined toward democracy, what they really support is rule by elites. Look at their welfare policies, their agendas. They all assume there must be sages and bureaucrats to run things. Rent-seeking through collective action defeats the free market. So what about liberalism? Remember what I said about libertarians? Liberalism, unless its believers are completely naive, is just imperialism in disguise. They believe in a world order, don't they? A non-interventionist global order. That only works if one nation dominates the rest. That's why we shouldn't casually say, I'm for democracy or I'm for liberalism. Not once you understand what they actually entail, because democracy almost always turns into bureaucracy, and liberalism nearly always imperialism in disguise. Why? Because we're Homo sapiens. Thanks for sticking through it.